Is a strong supporter of the COVID-19 vaccine, but says the government should not mandate it. This new rule would impact about 80 million Americans. Senator John Kennedy also is strongly opposed to the mandate, but encourages people to talk to their doctors about getting the shot. Some Jefferson Parish children were some of the first children in Louisiana to get their vaccines this week. Pediatric doses were given out at Ochsner's Children's Hospital. 10-year-old Ella Conrad got her vaccine in Lafayette. She has a compromised immune system and says getting the shot brings her one step closer to having her normal life back.
I feel fantastic.
I just want people to get vaccinated so I can play with my friends and have sleepovers. And it's hard to watch my friends go out and have sleepovers and play with their friends.
Health leaders say it will take some time before vaccine shots are available to all parts of the state. Parents should reach out to their local pharmacy to see when the vaccine will be available in their area. The Louisiana delegation is making a push in Congress to reform the National Flood Insurance Program. A second extension will be debated in December as lawmakers work to keep the government funded. Now, Senators Bill Cassidy and John Kennedy, along with Representative Clay Higgins, have filed legislation to adjust FEMA's risk rating 2.0.
The insurance program would adjust insurance rates based on flood risk, which could increase as much as 18% yearly. Only 23% of policyholders are estimated to be getting a cost decrease. There is a concern with the steep rises that thousands will drop their insurance coverage. The delegation is asking for a 9% cap.
So that people can kind of grow into that increased premium they're paying annually as opposed to sticker shock.
In the House bill, Congressman Clay Higgins lays out $500 million a year for FEMA to have more up-to-date maps. He suggests their rates are not accurate since the waterways have not been properly mapped. It also puts aside dedicated funds for specific policyholders like business interruption and flood mitigation grants.
But would also reward those homeowners that did things to mitigate their flood risk, to award communities that do things to mitigate the risk for a community at large.
Senator Cassidy noted the bipartisan infrastructure bill that is still awaiting a vote as it addresses some issues with the program.
They address waste, abuse, mismanagement, those things plaguing the program. It beefs up pre-disaster mitigation and coastal protection.
Louisiana is one of a handful of states that actually benefits from the program, so Senator Cassidy says it can be a challenge to get the rest of Congress on board.
That was Shannon Hecht reporting. Senator John Kennedy is pushing for more disaster relief aid for Louisiana. His focus is both on southeast Louisiana, recovering from Hurricane Ida, and the southwest. He told reporters that funding talks are expected to resume later this month as Congress once again has to decide whether to raise the debt ceiling. Senator Kennedy says he is not confident they will come to an agreement.
How do we keep government open for a while longer? I'm being facetious. We want government to, we want to properly fund, not overfund, not underfund, properly fund government with a real live budget. But I'm not sure we're going to be able to accomplish that in December.
Senator Kennedy says he does not support raising the debt ceiling. If a budget isn't passed soon, the government could shut down. Coming up, one of the amendments on the November 13th ballot explained in language we can all understand. And Governor John Bell Edwards is in Scotland. We'll have the latest on his trip.
This is your local election headquarters.
Welcome back. The Louisiana statewide election is this week. Voters will have to decide on 4 constitutional amendments. And political reporter Shannon Hecht is breaking them down for us. Amendment 3 could make some changes to levee districts.
Levee districts manage the construction and maintenance of levees. The legislature can create new levee districts if it wants to, and any district created before 2006 can levy up to 5 mills on property tax to help pay for levee work. A mill is a $1 tax for every $1,000 you pay in property tax. If this amendment passes, it would allow levee boards to vote to implement the mills in 8 districts.
Essentially just allows certain levee districts around the state to have the ability to go to their local voters and ask for additional increases in revenue to modify their levy protection systems.
If the majority of a district votes no, they can opt out.
But it gives those voters a right to choose their own destiny and how much they want to invest in their own levy districts.
Those in favor say that flood control is a major issue that levy boards should have more ease in dealing with.
Those parishes of concern who are in low flood areas as hurricane season and rain continues to be catastrophic, have to think about.
There are 5 levy districts that would mainly be impacted by this vote: the Chenier Plain Coastal Authority, Iberia Parish Levy, Squirrel Run, St. Tammany, and the Tangipahoa Levy District. If it doesn't pass, they will have to rely on private fundraising or ask other government entities for money. For your local election headquarters, I'm Shannon Hecht.
The election will take place on November 13th. Early voting has already begun, and you can find if your polling location has moved due to hurricane damage on our website. That's brproud.com. Governor John Bell Edwards spent the week in Scotland at the COP26 Climate Change Conference. He joined leaders across the world to take part in the Climate Resilience Adaptation Panel with the Environmental Defense Fund.
And if we want to do something in the near term that would have a tremendous impact to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it would be around methane in addition to CO2.
Other world leaders agree with Louisiana Governor John Bell Edwards.
What we're going to do between now and 2030 is going to impact significantly on whether we'll be able to meet our longer-term commitment.
President Joe Biden announces his move to limit methane emissions by tightening regulations for the oil and gas sector.
And one of the most important things we can do in this decisive decade is to keep 1.5 degrees in reach, is reduce our methane emissions as quickly as possible.
New proposed EPA rules could cut methane emissions by having oil and gas companies detect and repair methane leaks from equipment.
But all of that aging infrastructure, that legacy infrastructure, is leaky infrastructure. And I'm embarrassed to tell you we have 4,600 orphan wells in Louisiana. These are wells that haven't been properly plugged.
Edwards says they must stop methane leaks, which are more potent than CO2, from happening in old abandoned oil wells. With state and federal support, he believes the chemical industry will be able to transition into becoming more environmentally friendly.
What we have to do is show that if you want to be at a competitive disadvantage, do nothing. And watch what happens, because the world market is turning.
That was Rachel Riley reporting. The governor returns this week to Louisiana. He plans to announce his full climate change plan in February. Coming up, our Shannon Hecht sits down with pollster John Couvion to talk about how Democrats are seeing their seats in danger after elections along the coast. More after the break.
This is your local election headquarters.
Welcome back. This last week, there were some major elections across the country. They're going to have some implications for some of our races here in Louisiana. And we're joined by John Couvion of JMC Analytics. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Good to be here today.
John, I want to talk to you about some of these races in the other states that we saw, and they seem to be some pretty big upsets for Democrats. Can you talk to us about Virginia in particular?
Sure. So one of the things I think that's important to realize is when you're looking at election results from a particular election night, Virginia is certainly important, but there are also things going on in other states that all pointed to the same direction with regards to what I think the political coloration of last night was. Having said that, the part that was most notable out of Virginia is you're talking about a state that Joe Biden won by 10 points and that the Republicans have not had an elected governor in a decade. All of a sudden, the Republicans swept all 3 statewide offices by nearly identical margins. More importantly, they picked up enough seats in the state house to retake control of that chamber. So when you have that many consistent Republican victories going on there as well as elsewhere, you have to realize this is part, in my opinion, of a broader trend that has immediate and longer term implications.
Right. You know, in 2020, it sounded like, you know, the blue wave, the Democrats were trying to take control back after the Trump administration. But it seems with midterms coming up, it's not going to be quite as secure for them. Would you say that those trends are kind of showing that?
Oh, definitely. Because the thing is, the Democrats already have power by the narrowest of margins in the House and the Senate. In the Senate, you're talking about Kamala Harris's tie-breaking vote literally being their only means of control. In the House, the Democrats have a 5-vote margin. When I saw the numbers that I did in Virginia, which was a state that Joe Biden carried by 10 points, and in New Jersey, where the Democrats, Joe Biden more specifically, carried it by 17 points, and the incumbent governor was treading water against a challenger, when I see that kind of drop off of Democratic support, in my opinion, that means that you're talking about easily dozens of Democratic-held House seats and truthfully a few Senate seats flipping, which quite possibly could enable unified Republican control in 2023.
And I know you've really broken down the data on this. What was the reasoning behind this? Who was the demographic who came out that really swung it so far right this time?
So there's two halves of the equation here. One of the things which wasn't discussed, but I think should be, is not like some people are thinking where somehow the Democratic base deserted Joe Biden. You actually had healthy Democratic numbers in Democratic strongholds, both in New Jersey and in Virginia. But what happened was that not only did you have an energized Republican base in both states, but in swingy areas, I saw a massive swing to the Republicans. Let me give you one example. The city of Virginia Beach, which Joe Biden carried by 5 points, all 3 Republican candidates for statewide office in Virginia carried Virginia Beach by 8 points Tuesday night. In other words, a 13-point swing in 1 year in a swingy area. So that to me is emblematic of problems Democrats will have next year, because in my opinion, if you have a district that Joe Biden carried by 55% of the vote or less, in which 49 House Democrats and 4 Senate Democrats fall under that metric, they have problems.
And we've seen in the past of, whatever party is in power, usually around midterms, their approval rating drops down, maybe they lose some seats. Is this pretty normal what we're seeing, or is this on the more extreme side?
Drop-off in support is normal. The question then becomes, to what extent do you have gains? In other words, do you have, say, a 5 to 10 seat gain versus, say, a 20 to 40 seat gain? And what is notable in this case, unlike other cycles, is when you're talking about losing a state like Virginia that some people thought was irrevocably lost to the Republicans, and you're barely holding on in New Jersey, that to me is emblematic of a larger problem for the Democrats, kind of like what I saw happening in 2009 and 1993.
Mm-hmm. And what can the Democrats, what do you imagine they're trying to do to maybe slow this down so they don't lose as many seats? We have, the midterm elections next year. Louisiana has a Senate seat open. So, what's kind of these conversations we're thinking going to look like over the next year?
So you have the conversation of what they believe is the reason, and you have the conversation of what they should be talking about. Let me first talk about what they believe is the reason, and that was because their infrastructure bill has not yet reached the finish line. They think that inaction is what caused these Republican victories. I am of the opinion that the broader problem is that you have multiple things hurting the Biden administration at the same time. Number one, inflation. Number two, the surge of gas prices. Number three, the supply chain shortages you're hearing about. Number four, the vaccine mandate for those of 100 or more employees, where I think that when you go from the theoretical stage of talking about it to people actually losing their jobs, that fear, I think, is also hurting the Democrats.
Right. It's not only Congress where we're going to be seeing these changes. We have our own governor race in 23, yes. And no one's really officially announced yet, but there's been some teases of Attorney General Jeff Landry as well as Lieutenant Governor Billy Nungesser. And would you say with this kind of more conservative wave coming through that, a little bit more farther to the right candidates such as Jeff Landry, do you believe that he, potentially get a little bit more farther in the numbers than, a little bit more moderate Billy Nungesser?
Well, the interesting thing about what you're describing is you really have two pieces of the puzzle. You have 2022 and 2023. Given the patterns of support I saw for the Democrats versus Republicans in Virginia, I see some similarities here in Louisiana. In other words, if you as a Democrat are trying to run in a statewide or congressional race next year, and you think you could somehow flip ancestrally Democratic voters in a place like Avoyelles Parish or Calcasieu Parish or places like that, well, I think that's less likely to happen. So that, in my opinion, makes Senator Kennedy a safer lock for re-election. It also makes the 5 incumbent Republican congressmen safer. Now, getting to your specific question, which I see as more of a 2023 thing, I think there's going to be multiple Republican entrants into the race. And so Jeff Landry is not going to have the conservative/Republican vote all to himself, because you're hearing stories about several legislators thinking of running. There's a question about whether State Treasurer John Schroeder could run, whether some public service commissioners could run. In other words, I could see a wide open field where the conservative vote will have more than one choice to choose from than just Jeff Landry.
And John, we're in the middle of early voting already for an election here in Louisiana. So people are already kind of saying that this is going to be a very low turnout for 4 constitutional amendments as well as some more local elections going on. What are you kind of seeing in the numbers for early voting?
So what's kind of interesting, you're correct in that I do expect low turnout. My current projection is 16% statewide and about 35% in Orleans Parish. When you look at the specific early vote numbers themselves, they are actually not that bad, but they come with a strong caveat. More specifically, I'm talking about, as of last night, 109,000 have early voted. And when you compare that against the treasurer's special election back in 2017, at this point in time, only 68,000 had early voted. So on the surface, that would seem like a 40,000 vote increase in turnout. The caveat that I have, though, you have over 60% of the vote thus far has been coming in from mail-in ballots. And what I think that is a function of is when the election was delayed a month thanks to Hurricane Ida, that gave mail-in ballots more time to come in. So I see the heavy mail-in ballot as artificially increasing the turnout that you're seeing on the early vote, but I don't think that necessarily means we would have something like a 30% statewide turnout. So a little caveat in those numbers. But still, it's impressive to see that 109,000 have early voted for something that is a pretty low wattage statewide election. And in East Baton Rouge, I want to say we're pushing about 15,000 of that right now.
Right, well, that election is coming up on November 13th on Saturday, so we'll be in touch with you probably to see, how this really turns out. But John, thank you so much for, breaking this down for us.
Always my pleasure.
All right, we'll be right back.
This is your local election headquarters.
Welcome back. Looking ahead to the coming week, this Saturday is Election Day in Louisiana. Voters will weigh in on local races, state constitutional amendments, and some state legislative seats. Early voting just ended yesterday. However, November 9th is the deadline to request an absentee ballot. November 12th is the deadline to have it into the registrar's office. And you can always vote on Election Day. That's November 13th. Polls open at 7 a.m. and close at 8 p.m. Thank you for joining us for This Week in Louisiana Politics. I'm Fred Childers. Stay safe, stay informed, and I'll see you next Sunday right here on your local election headquarters.